something more like that sort of outcome. And that's really what I want to explore. And I'm going to explore it by looking at London, partly because I've just got this lovely animation to show you, and I love maps. But I want to start exploring something bigger, which is about urbanism rather than about urban design. So I'm going to show you London. I'm going to show you London in the 1950s. This was the value map of London in the 1950s. Hadn't it changed very much from the days when Oscar Wilde penned, in Lady Bracknell's words, the primeness of Belgravia. As you can see, it's pretty much, high-value London was pretty much confined to bits of Belgravia with Mayfair and St James's and so forth tagged on. And then as London became increasingly grew economically, became a much more dominant sort of national capital. We saw more wealth created, and the areas that were colonised sort of spread west down the King's Road. This is 1960s prime London. 1970s, we saw the first influx of foreign money, the Middle Eastern money, which favoured the north of Hyde Park, sort of Bayswater sector, so it grew again. 1980s, in the run-up to Big Bang, saw the American money coming in. So around about this time, we start looking at the internationalisation, the emergence of London as a truly global capital. And my point here is that there was something about the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure, the streetscape of London, that attracted and started to attract all these people from around the world, but also accommodated them, causing values to rise. There was something fundamental about the DNA of London, if you like, and the incredible flexibility and adaptability of the city that enabled all this. And the 1990s saw more of the same, the emergence of Notting Hill and so forth. And really, the noughties have just seen, and up to date, have just seen the constant sort of expansion of high-value London, as it is absolutely preeminently, if not it could well be that it's the preeminent global city, actually, I think, from all sorts of points of view. And just incredibly unique amongst world cities in what it has to offer. There's no other world city, even Paris, that we study, where there's quite as much choice and variety and the ability to buy freehold, own everything from ground to sky. That's very unusual in world city sense. So there's something about the physical fabric of London that enabled all this value to accrue, and it's attractive value, and of course a huge economy, financial services, all sorts of industries, really, service industries on the back of that. Why do I say this? Well, because actually I think there's another factor that's very important in here, which is land ownership and management. I think it is no accident that many of those pink areas, highest value areas, are actually those of the great estates. And we've looked at 5-year growth lately, and everybody knows about just how much growth there has been in central London because of all these foreign buyers and and the fact that wealth is gathering there. I often think that actually if we saw a big property in Mayfair, it's actually more like a billionaire setting up global HQ and bringing a huge amount of work and money with them rather than a straightforward domestic purchase. So we've got this terribly vibrant city. Look at the highest growing areas: Knightsbridge, Mayfair, Chelsea, Belgravia. There's the Grove, Howard, Walden, the Cadogan and so forth, all the big estates actively managing these places. And I think it's quite interesting to note that in some locations, and Notting Hill for example, seems to be one of them, once the money has arrived, it actually kind of kills off the vibrancy that attracted the money in the first place. And we saw, for example, after the 1980s, I think South Kensington becoming, for example, relatively less fashionable than it had been as a result of that. Now, that's slightly contentious. Don't often say it in public. So, I don't. It's very much a part of the debate here. But there seems to be an added factor. It's not just the physical grain; it's actually ongoing management of place that seems to be a really important story. Certainly in the value of London here, and I use London because it's a particularly stark and extreme example. So what I'm saying is, was this actually the biggest advance in urbanism? This is the first Earl of Grosvenor. What is it that's important about this, and what can we learn and take forward and think about today? Well, I think urbanism, urban design, placemaking is about very much more than just the physical design of buildings. It's much less an extension of architecture as the arrival of geography, sociology, economics into the built realm. So the sort of thing I'm recommending to clients at the moment, and I think it's very interesting to note that where now economic conditions are starting to be right for some of our very large-scale developers, owners of large tracts of land for development, to actually start developing again. I'm increasingly talking about this sort of issue. These are the sort of conclusions and recommendations we come to. That actually the design effort has to be concentrated on streets, not the architecture. On fine-grained use, not big box use. And I felt particularly, I stayed in a Novotel, Paddington, in something that Paddington Central, which is a long walk from Paddington Station. And I was just particularly struck by how completely and utterly dead the so-called Central Street was. You know, the architecture is fabulous, the spec, the finishes, funky street lighting, great cobbles and what have you, but just completely dead. I think, and that's very much sort of big box, glass plated architecture, as it were. Real places. This, the photo, by the way, is Elizabeth Street, which has been hugely improved and sort of dragged Belgravia southward, done by the Grosvenor estate. Deliberately chosen this picture because there's activity, there's an event happening here. It's been organised by the landowner with residents and so their sort of and street party. So it's as much about place management and making sure that you keep the local butcher and all the right shops and fine-grained stuff going, as it is about the physical design place. Of course, physical design does come into it because streets, traditional streets do seem to be incredibly adaptable, and Georgian houses, again, very flexible in terms of the uses they contain. But it doesn't have to be, nothing about the tradition of sash windows that's particularly important here, but what is important is that underlying deep-seated design. I've already talked about the importance of looking at whole values per hectare, as it were, and even more important, the emphasis on the long-term ownership of income over time, without the necessity of actually selling to another at the end of that. And I think it's that at the moment, certainly, in the new environment, seems to be winning out. So all this sounds terribly difficult, starting from where we are now. But I think what it does show is that there are people doing it already. And I want to end on a more optimistic note and bring in some of the trends that I've detected at a global level are happening that really impinge on property. So there are, again, all sorts of surveys and things that we've carried out, and the movement of global wealth that we've started to look at leads us to conclude that actually the world is changing. It's in changing key ways that actually, I think, pull us much more towards this approach to the built environment. What do I mean by this? Well, if I spend a lot of time in airports now, so I thought this was an appropriate sort of metaphor. But what's driving is a world based on equity rather than debt. And I think the credit crunch undoubtedly exacerbated this, but interestingly, even in the UK and occupied housing, that was already happening. The level of mortgage and occupation has fallen since 2000. But at a global level, what does that mean? Well, it means that, again, the late 20th century model, when investors were looking to acquire an asset for capital growth, to grow the value of an asset, has shifted towards a world where you're using equity to buy an income. Global investors are searching for yield, and for much longer periods now. And a lot of those investors are private wealth, not corporate money. So we've seen a shift, for example, again, all this showing up in London. The real financial services sector activity is showing up in the West End. That's where the life is. It's not out in the city. The big corporate banks are still trying to sort out their mess. And then there's a kind of more touchy-feely sort of shift from equities, for example, to commodities when it comes to investment, all as a result of this emphasis on equity, move, of, as I've already said, from capital growth to income, derivatives to direct investment, and direct investment in land, utilities, food, things we're all going to keep needing, and indeed residential property. This is particularly important, not just to private wealth, but also the traditional investing institutions. One of the key changes that is happening is the rise in number of older people, as we all know. These pension funds now are faced with actually having to meet pension payments going forward over a long period of time. So increasingly need to find investments that will produce that income so they can pay the pensions out over time. And certainly residential property has a whole different sort of set of attractions and reasons for investment compared, for example, offices. And I suspect the old globalism that meant for sort of standardization, conformity, is actually being replaced by a world which is much more about the differences, for example, between cities or the attractions. So we've got simultaneously this global capability in terms of technology, but a much more local response to it that I see in markets. And let me try and illustrate how all this is landing. And I apologise for picking out London so often, but it really is, I think, the cutting edge, as it were, of this change. But there are two deals that were done this year that I think are particularly good at illustrating how this change in global conditions is actually impacting in the real world, in the property world. So the first was the sale of East Village, or what most of us know as the Athletes' Village at the Olympic Park. The sale of that new, if you like, London estate, and it wasn't sold to the usual suspects, of course. The money, the backing was Qatar DR, so it was Middle East money and kind of commercial property capability there. So that's that move from corporate debt to private equity. And then at the same time, we were seeing Ivanhoe Cambridge, which is an absolutely enormous Canadian pension fund, again embarking on this a desperate global search for income and yield, putting a slug of money into residential land to acquire or to build to let in London. So I think the first of many tranches of potential income-orientated investment in residential property. So my point is, this is already impacting, it's starting to happen. And then, at the other things, when we're, and this is my last slide, so I'll try and wrap up with it. Those global forces are changing commercial realities, so that even businesses themselves, when we're looking at the purely commercial sector, are changing their requirements. Whoever would have thought that a roundabout in the middle of East London would have become Britain's answer to Silicon Valley, but it has. And what's important here? Well, it's the emphasis, the new emphasis in the corporate world on people and what people want. And the importance we're increasingly asked by commercial property developers, not what the headline rent is on a piece of property, but what the housing market is like, what kind of quality place and housing can they provide as an extended offering once their workers get outside their front door. These guys are competing for talent on a global scale, and they are needing to attract the best people to wherever it is they set up. And this is where we come full circle. It's where the urbanism really matters, and the quality of place and the life in place. And where actually architecture, perhaps you can see the roundabout itself, actually is relatively unimportant. So there are bigger forces, factors, economic stories, social stories, global trends, demographic trends, all coming together, which actually are militating in favour of urbanism. I think the real challenge, and something that it would be worth paying attention to today, is how the industry and the built environment can respond to that challenge, and perhaps how we all need to keep joining up far more designers with financial innovators, or who knows, a Chinese investor somewhere may be the key to the next big thing in urbanism. I hope that's given sufficient food for thought and broadened the argument out away from just this straightforward relationship between design and value to actually thinking about how do we capture that value. Thank you very much.